Thank you very much for that most kind invitation. Is that mic picking up adequately? Otherwise, I just use my big voice. Thank you, ladies, for once again having guests in khaki into the club after all of these years. I'm accompanied today by my liaison officer, Lieutenant Izzy Crowdis. You've got two generations here today, markedly different generations, as I'm reminded when I have most conversations with Izzy. I don't glue my day or my week together without Izzy. I'm privileged to have what we call a liaison officer. If you're imagining executive assistant but then put them on steroids, that's the support that Izzy provides me. So thank you for having both of us here today. I've written words on pages to speak today 2 or 3 times over the last couple of weeks and hit delete or drop things in the rubbish bin, to be honest. And what I settled on was trying to perhaps share both, reflect on Anzac Day appropriately, but share some of my experiences, be as honest about my personal journey in Army, some of the things that are happening in Army at the moment, of course the wonderful 2nd Health Brigade, and perhaps therefore prompt some really interesting conversation and questions over dessert. So I beg your indulgence as I will jump sort of across 4 different things as opposed to a thematic, well-crafted speech. Anzac Day, of course. My experience and current role, and courtesy of the very gracious invitation, I can probably drop a bunch of those things now. My least favourite topic is myself. But more importantly, from that, to talk about the 2nd Health Brigade. I'd like to reflect on my view of Army as an employer of women and some of the things that I've learned or observed across my considerable number of years, it turns out now. And then I'd like to reflect on some female firsts in Army because for me as a woman in Army, and I think for all women at the moment, it's a particularly exciting time, courtesy of some announcements that were made on the 9th of April, but I will come to that last. Firstly, Anzac Day. We all clearly understand the history of the origins of Anzac Day and that it has been commemorated, I think, increasingly well, if I can be so bold, over many, many years now, over more than a century. And I say increasingly well because it has become more inclusive. And your recognition of Indigenous service in World War I, I'm very appreciative of. It's something that reflects poorly on our society at the time, but is something that we endeavour to ensure that we appropriately recognise in the modern era. Anzac Day has really obvious significance to all of us that serve. It's a little bit of a statement of the obvious. We pause and reflect on the generations of those that have served in the military that have come before us, and for many of us it has a really clear focus on the difficult circumstance in which they served. Through major conflict, something that we have graciously not seen for some time, and in a different social construct in terms of the appreciation and recognition that was afforded to military personnel at the time. But I always feel phenomenally privileged around Anzac Day because we inside the military pause and reflect, but we get to do that inside of the current Australian society that does so in stride with us and in fact leads the way. Across the next, or probably happening already, but this week, next week, through past Anzac Day, depending on where school holidays are, everywhere from preschools to retirement villages will be doing Anzac Day focused activities. And those activities range from wonderful events like today through to football matches and, dare I say, Anzac Day biscuit cooking competitions. One of which I got to judge this morning at my own headquarters. So if I don't eat all my lunch, it's because I ate about 8 Anzac biscuits only an hour and a half ago or so. On that note, if anyone's got any connections where I can have a judging appointment at the Sydney Royal Show in the baking section, I'm all up for it, with one judging gig on my resume so far. But no, more seriously, ladies, there's such an amazing variety of ways in which we pause, recognise, reflect and commemorate at this time of year. And I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to come and be part of that here with you today. It also provides, and thinking about the opportunity Izzy and I had coming to meet so many of you today, Anzac Day is something of a tipping point that encourages current defence engagement in the community. Over the Anzac season, if I can describe it that way, because we do a lot of things either side of the 25th of April, there will be people out engaging everywhere from old people's homes to primary schools. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us to come out into the community, support the formal commemorations, that's an important part of it, but to also just meet amazing people. So we're very privileged to have that opportunity. And I do acknowledge, and I think at this time, and it's why I appreciate the comments about Indigenous participation in the early wars, I often reflect on those that did not have that society in which to sit at the time of their service. The earlier wars and Vietnam veterans in particular, I reflect on at this time of year because they didn't have that wonderful privilege of the support that we have from the Australian community today. All right, topic 2, so that you can all eat your lunch. My career, my least favourite topic, it's been covered beautifully, thank you, we'll move right on. A little bit about, I suppose, what drives me and the things that don't appear in a bio. If I was to summarise my career, it's been many years now. I started in the Army Reserve and then transferred to full-time service. If I had to put it in a sentence, I'd describe it as phenomenally hard, bracket only at times, but incredibly rewarding and full of unique opportunities. And they've been spread out over 29 full-time years now, nearly. I'm not sure what happened. It's clearly been exciting. I blinked, I turned around and I had been in for a long time. And that's relevant. I never thought that I would join and serve 30 plus years. I joined the Army because I was a really bad law student. I needed a credible job and I was going to do Army until I figured out what I was going to do when I grew up. I think this now has to be it because I'm running out of time to do something completely different, unless there's a job going at the club. Maybe that could be my second career. I grew up in Wheatbelt, Western Australia, so on wheat and sheep farming, sort of marginal farming, really small communities. My primary school that I was in until partway through year 7, that was in primary school in Western Australia at that time, had a total of 6 children in it at the end. Then they closed the school, then I had to go to boarding school, which is where I was headed anyway because there are no high schools in that part of Western Australia. So those early days probably made me a little bit tough, which assisted in my surviving at the era that I joined the Army. But like I say, I never thought I'd be here this late. I did Army Reserve for a few years whilst being a really bad law student. I apologise to all the lawyers. You have a profession that I clearly cannot aspire to. And then I went through the military college, the Royal Military College in Canberra. At that point in time, it was about more than a decade into men and women training alongside each other doing the same initial training. So whilst I'm medical corps, I'm not a clinical person. So I did general service officer training at the college and then got allocated to medical corps. That was my first preference, absolutely my first preference. And as I was chatting with a couple of the ladies beforehand, I think in part that was because I knew I couldn't carry my pack very far and I thought that I would be better suited to medical corps. I've had a career of amazing variety and some of that was touched on in the summary of my bio. The variety that perhaps doesn't come out when we just look at those data points that are in biographies is the variety of people that I've got to work with. By being in the health services, I've worked largely in a gender-balanced workforce through my entire time in Army. And if I'm honest, it was probably one of the things that led me towards seeking to have this career, not be allocated somewhere else when I finished at the military college. I've also worked with a very educated and professional group because so many inside the health services are trained nurses, doctors, psychologists, physiotherapists, dentists. And that has been, I think that's led to my longevity because I've had that professional peerage and had that really gender-balanced environment. I've also had an opportunity to work in a number of roles where there's been a very high public service portion of the defence workforce. Many of my colleagues, and I'm going to maybe insert male colleagues at this rank level, will spend their careers out in military units, and then you post them to Canberra and they can't work out how to talk to the APS people because they're normal. So I've been the APS people are normal, not perhaps my military colleagues. So I've been very fortunate in that regard. And all of that, influenced by really good people and some of the postings that were mentioned, led me to the 2nd Health Brigade. Did I aspire to be a brigade commander when I joined the Army? No, I thought I was going to do about 10 years and figure out what I was going to do when I grew up. And we didn't have a health brigade. So brigade command was not an aspiration of mine because there just wasn't the opportunity. And then it all fell into place at a very convenient point in my career, if I can be completely honest. So the 2nd Health Brigade stood up on the 3rd of March, should remember our birthday, early March last year. It brought together our health battalions under a headquarters that is health focused. And that has been really important in helping us generate the change we need to in how Army generates health capabilities at the moment. We are very focused on the deployable part of the health system. So we don't run the health clinics that are on the garrison that soldiers, sailors and airmen go to as sort of, GP and health services at home. We are all about the health facilities, the small hospitals, the teams that you see working out of military vehicles and under canvas in remote parts of the world. But we do a lot of other things along the way, and you would have through COVID and bushfires and other disasters, you'll see this thread of health workforce being there. That is our deployable workforce. We can just deploy them here in Australia to do a range of things as well. Some things about the brigade. We're about 1,600 people strong, and that is approximately 50-50 gender balanced. It's also about 50-50 full-time versus part-time or Army Reserve. We would not have a health capability without our very, very valuable part-time or Army Reserve staff. They are the bedrock of all the specialist capacity that we need. So we have very few full-time high-end medical specialists, surgeons, anaesthetists, etc. We're very, very reliant on having that part-time workforce. We're spread across a really convenient 34 locations around Australia, of which 7 are sort of the larger footprints. There's 4 subordinate units to the brigade, and they are based out of Townsville, Brisbane, Darwin and Adelaide. And that is aligned to where Army has its combat brigades. So we're laid down to align to the force that we support. We support them on operations and in training. And then there are smaller they're not outposts, they're company sizes, so they're a reasonable size. Perth, Melbourne and a company here in Sydney as well as our headquarters. So they're sort of our 7 main locations. And the other smaller locations are things like small numbers of medics in the remote force surveillance units structures across the north of Australia, and some residual elements that we adopted that are part-time and are located in places like Tasmania. So we're kind of everywhere. I had an aspiration when I took up the job that I'd visit every location. I'm going to fail dismally, but I do try to get around the main locations about quarterly, which creates an interesting challenge. We always have people on deployment around the world. Low numbers at the moment, fortunately. But they are doing everything from being part of the Australian forces, training the Ukraine forces in the UK. They work on operations that are part of Border Protection Command. They do training team type work into the region to both keep our own Army forces fit and well that are there, but also to do health training of Indigenous forces in places like East Timor and Papua New Guinea. So we're busy. It has its challenges though. New organisations are hard. I think that's a statement of the obvious for anyone that, for probably everybody in this room. I don't get to pick my own team. So that was interesting last year. It's like, here, stand up a new organisation and here's who you have to have. Now, it does save me the hassle of doing recruiting type work. That's fantastic. but it can be a little bit tricky. You can bear influence, but you don't get to recruit your own team. We've also stood up the Health Brigade at a time of significant change in defence. So the Defence Strategic Review was released about the same week as we were created, and that has captured the shift in the strategic situation that Australia faces, and therefore all of the Defence Force has to respond to that. So we are going from being a deployable health workforce that used to do things in the Middle East area of operations, where we worked out of things called forward operating bases that were really secure. The enemy was not as militarily capable as the coalition by any stretch. We had a wonderful thing when it comes to health called air superiority, which basically means the enemy can't shoot your aircraft out of the sky. And that meant that we could rely really heavily on rotary wing evacuation. So if you were a critically injured soldier or civilian in where we were working that we could help in Afghanistan, and you got into a helicopter, you had a 98% chance of living. That is how successful and how capable the care was in those forward deployed facilities that were in the Middle East. Now, we only led a small-scale facility early in operations in Afghanistan, and then we, the ADF, augmented into large coalition facilities. But an amazing opportunity to develop the clinical skill of our workforce. But what we prepare for now, as a mitigation that I hope never needs to be used, is potentially conflict of a very different nature. And that is a challenge that we face in the Health Brigade. And I think should we ever need to be employed at scale, it'll be a particular challenge for our community. We have challenges in workforce. I think Defence's recruiting issues, and in fact the ability for business to get workforce is a common thread. And we have that very heavy reliance on specialist practitioners out of the civilian sector. I've talked about the dispersed location piece. It's interesting to try to lead a new organisation that is so vastly spread. The other thing that I've noticed that I didn't expect when asked/told about which my next job was, you don't get to recruit your own team, but you also don't need to do job applications and interviews. They just tell you where you're going. It's kind of convenient. Defence is busy and changing. So we had the Defence Strategic Review about 12 months ago, and then just on Wednesday, the National Defence Strategy and the revised Integrated Investment Program was released. So the decision-making, particularly about resources, architecture and defence, is very busy. There's a lot of change. So as a new formation, trying to cut through and get a voice to get your key issues looked at, it has been more challenging in this last 12 months than I think it would have been at sort of any time in the 20 years prior had we stood up the Health Brigade then. So I just can't get a louder voice and go and annoy more people about the things that we need. And we are fundamentally working in, although there is a massive amount of public money that goes into the defence budget, in terms of how we function at a brigade level, we operate in a resource austere environment, making sure we get everything we can out of every public dollar that is given to us. I also try to get everything I can out of every person whilst making sure that they stay and don't want to leave because I've made them work too hard. All right, I because I didn't script this fully, I'm at risk of, I'll scoot along because I'm checking my watch occasionally, making sure that everyone's lunch doesn't go cold. Some comments, if I may, about ARMY as an employer of women. I think that ARMY is an extraordinarily good employer of women, but I do appreciate that not every woman's experience who joins the Defence Force will be like mine. I didn't appreciate how, and I joined sort of mid-90s, I didn't appreciate how good an employer it was, because let's be honest, I'd only been employed at a part-time job in a fruit and veg shop. So I didn't have a major employer to compare to, let's be honest. But I had two pivotal experiences that made me appreciate what ARMY and by extrapolation, Defence offered women. The first was that I participated in a Chief Executive Women's Program in, I should remember exactly when, I'm going to say it was about 2008 or 9. And the construct of that program was that businesses participated You all had sort of 4 women from your business, and Army was one of these businesses that participated, and we did a lunch series and hosted each other. That was my first real exposure to real people, right, that didn't wear uniforms. And I was flabbergasted to talk to those professional women and have them talk about a pay gap. I'm literally like, what's that? Like, the pay schedule says that you pay a lieutenant colonel this much money. So I had been spoiled and inoculated from the realities of a gender pay gap because defence pays everybody the same. And work value, but there's pros and cons. There's no merit element to pay. There's no bonuses. The work value is off the responsibilities of a role. It has nothing to do with how well you do or don't do the role. So there are pros and cons. But I was astounded to meet these women and hear their stories about gender pay gap, about their jobs disappearing if they went off on maternity leave. I'd come back and the job would just be gone. That's when I first started thinking about how good I had it in many respects being inside Army. Then when I deployed to Afghanistan in particular, I worked alongside a number of American women. And that's when I started to appreciate the Australian view, both Army and wider defence, about women and families. So in the US system, they would deploy women regardless of, I think it was only a 6-week window. As long as you'd had your baby at least 6 weeks ago, they'd deploy you. They deployed women and men without consideration of dual couple families. So the assumption just was that the family would work out how to get the children looked after because dad was getting deployed to one part of the world and mum was getting deployed somewhere else. And again, there's people shaking their head around the room. Here I had sat naively in the environment that Army and the Australian Defence Force offered me and not realised that even my uniformed sisters around the world were subject to those things. I think America's got a little bit better since then, chucking them under the bus. We've also had over time all opportunities in terms of employment open to women. I'm going to say only and then quote a date that's a while ago, but it was only in 1984 that the RAAC school and the Women's Royal Army, Women's Royal Australian Army Corps were transitioned and the women just went into the normal corps, like the corps for the jobs they were doing. And it's more than a lifetime ago for Izzy and maybe some of the other people in the room, but we've actually come a long, long way and we're now at a point where all employment is open. I also think we have an overwhelmingly positive culture, though we're a big organisation and we can always do better. And as I got driven, or we were driving back to the airport last night in Brisbane to fly back to Sydney, I had one of my staff with me, male. I think he's probably served 15 or 20 years in health roles. And don't go back and tell your former boss that I talked about him, Izzy. He made, when I was explaining what I was doing today, he made 2 comments because they just came up in the chat in the car. He observed that he'd always had female bosses. And I'm like, haha, that's why you're so good at your job. He might have been all right without it, right? But then he said something that really resonated with me. He said, I've never seen any gender-based animosity towards female leaders in Army. And he's been in about 15, 20 years. And I was like, gosh, maybe we have come a long way, which I thought was fabulous. All right. Firsts, and I know that I'm past 15 minutes, I apologise. I appreciate there's a theme across your lunches that is female firsts, but I'm going to emphasise today what I'm going to call a first, a second and a third that's happened in the Australian Army. So on the 9th of April, they announced the new defence leadership that will transition in the middle of the year. And much was made that day, quite rightly, that the Australian Defence Force will have 3 3-star generals. So it's like 2 ranks higher than me and like really, really close to God. We'll have 3 3-star senior officers come the middle of the year. If you saw the photo, you'd note that they were all wearing green. So we're actually going to have 3 Army 3-star generals, so lieutenant generals, come the 1st of July. That will be 75% of Army's 3-star generals. It's awesome. I love it. So what's important is how amazing those 3 women are. Because if someone was to look at the statistics, they might make the false presumption that they might not be merit-based appointments, or maybe there was some special program to get women to that level. Those 3 women are Natasha Fox, who is currently the Chief of Personnel for Defence, and she took up that role on the 1st of July last year. Michelle McGuinness, who's the National Cyber Coordinator, and Susan Coyle, my current boss, and I'm very sad that I lose her, but happy that she gets promoted, and she will be the Chief of Joint Capabilities from the 1st of July. What is common of those 3 women, and I know each of them really well, is that they are exceptional human beings. They're exceptional at their technical role, if I can, they're not necessarily over. One has a personnel background, one has a intelligence background, and Susan Coyle comes from a communications and signals background, but works as what we call a generalist. She's commanding Forces Command at the moment. They're exceptional humans at their job, but they're exceptional leaders. And I had a little cheeky look at social media, I try not to, after General Coyle's promotion and future appointment were announced, because I kind of wanted to check that there wasn't anything too vile out there. It was overwhelmingly positive. It was refreshing. So that's one of the things that is common about them. The other thing that's common about them is they've all got families. They all happen to have service spouses, and they are the senior rank in the household. I'll point that one out. But they all have families, and their children are late teens into early 20s. So they have achieved these amazing careers and had families along the way. How did we get there? I'm over time, I'm so sorry. I'll do this really quickly. I think there's a number of inputs to how we got there. Decisions made back in the 80s that women would be able to enter defence and do the same training pipeline as men opened job opportunities, which meant that now as that generation has grown through, they've got similar experience and education and training to genuinely compete with their male colleagues. And if you see the data, female representation picks up as you get to senior ranks. Strong leadership in our organisation. It never took affirmative action targets, but it did take strong leadership about appreciating diversity, and that was male leadership, and the setting of some parameters. So there was a point in time, and I think it's correctly attributable to General Angus Campbell, who's currently the CDF, where inside Army, there wasn't a target about unit commanding officers being female, but every single panel or shortlist was to have a female on it. When I did my preparatory course for unit command of over a decade ago, there was me on there and an education officer going into a role that did the CO, had to do the pre-command course, but wasn't a conventional unit. 1 out of about sort of 40, effectively, 1 plus my very dear education corps colleague. Now there's numerous. So it just normalised over time. Defence has also become a bit more specialist. So I talked about the backgrounds of those 3 women, and we've realised as an organisation we've become more specialist, but also the value of specialist leadership. So there are senior intelligence officers now at 3-star. There are senior personnel specialists at 3-star. If you go back 10, 15 years, you know how we filled those sorts of jobs? We just put the combat blokes in them, right? Because they were the only ones that had grown through to the level. So there's been a big organisational shift. We also had an amazing group of women who got to 2-star rank, so the one above my rank at the moment. And that started, I'm talking about the full-time workforce. I apologise because I didn't go and research the part-time workforce in great detail. But the first one was in 2007, and that was Major General Liz Cosson. After that, we had Simone Wilkie and Kath Toohey come through in 2015, 2017. Now, those women departed Defence at 2-star, but they paved the way for us to grow those 3-stars. So I personally am very, very appreciative of the Army I get to serve in today and the women that have gone before me.